Okay, hello everyone. It's 2 o'clock and we're going to get started. Welcome to today's webinar, EHS Regulatory Roundup, what's new, what's next, and what it means for you. My name is Bob Kimball. I am the Director of Marketing here at Dakota Software. I'm joined today by Jennifer Mester, a regulatory analyst with Dakota's in-house regulatory team. This is something new for us. Some of you may have been on our webinars in the past. This is the first time we're offering kind of these quarterly regulatory roundup webinars. We know there's a lot of uncertainty in the regulatory environment right now, and we have in-house regulatory expertise, and we want to share that with the EHS community. We also know that EHS professionals are busy, so we are going to attempt to deliver this information as quickly as possible. So we've scheduled 15 minutes where Jennifer is going to go through some of the more significant regulatory developments from the first quarter. I will then go through a very short overview of Dakota's solutions for helping to manage changes in compliance programs. We do welcome questions, though. Obviously, with a large number of attendees, everyone's muted right now, but please, we anticipate and welcome questions. You can ask them at any time through the Q&A widget, and then we will address as many of them as we can at the conclusion. And if we can't get to them, then we will follow up with you with the responses. So without further ado, I'll now turn it over to Jennifer to tell you a bit about herself and about our regulatory team. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bob. Hi, everybody. I'm Jennifer, and as Bob mentioned, I am a member of Dakota's regulatory team. I'm a regulatory analyst here. I've been with Dakota for about 1.5 years. I've been in environmental software for around 3 years, and I have about 20 years of EH&S experience. I have done everything from consulting to on-site EH&S management to environmental software. And as part of our regulatory team, I am part of the team that researches and reviews proposed and new EHS regulations every day. We analyze the regulations, and then we create applicability and checklist questions and summary information to help a user understand if a regulation is applicable to their operations and what their requirements are. As a team, we have a very diverse background. We have scientists, environmental attorneys, and previous EH&S professionals like myself. So first, we just want to make a quick acknowledgement that talking about federal regulations, especially during an administration transition, can have a political undertone to it. But we want to stress that Dakota, as a company, does not take a political stance. Dakota is on the side of industry. We are not for or against any specific regulations. And we alert users to all changes in regulations. That can mean new requirements that are added, existing requirements that are removed, or any other changes that are made. So right now, we have to talk about the fact that we are in a federal administration transition. This is not anything new. We've been through these in the past, and we know that disruptions in regulatory processes are expected during federal transitions. We know that an outgoing administration will typically propose and adopt more regulations, and that an incoming administration will typically look to freeze or postpone many of those last-minute regulatory changes to determine if they fit with their new administration's goals and priorities. So right now, there are 2 ways that this is really impacting the current regulatory climate. There was a January 20th presidential memorandum titled Regulatory Freeze Pending Review. What that did was it directed agencies to consider postponing effective dates for rules that had not yet taken effect in order to review any question of fact, law, and policy that may arise. And what does that really mean? What have we seen? Regulation effective dates have been postponed. Enforcement discretion has happened for agencies for regulations that have already taken effect. And then we've also seen the reopening of comment periods or extension of comment periods for previously proposed rules. The other way this is happening is with congressional disapprovals. So a congressional disapproval can be used by a new administration to overturn regulations which went into effect within the last 60 legislative days of the prior administration. Generally, they're going to target regulations that are not in alignment with the new administration's priorities. And this requires multiple steps. It requires passing by the House, the Senate, and then a presidential signature to sign it into law. So what's new for first quarter 2025? And what's the status of these regulations? There have been a lot of updates. As we've already mentioned, the outgoing administration typically issues more regulations, and that's exactly what the Biden administration did. There were a lot of new and proposed regulations that came out at the end of 2024 and right into the beginning of 2025. We've pulled a list together of some of the more broadly impactful recent regulatory updates that we want to highlight. I also want to note that we color-coded them. So we just talked about congressional disapprovals, and we also talked about the regulatory freeze. We've color-coded these so you can see how these regulations have been or have not been impacted by those new administrative tools. I'm going to run through a few of these in more detail. I won't get through all of them because we're only targeting 15 minutes here, but I want to just give you an idea of what we've discussed in terms of the regulatory freeze and the congressional disapproval, what it means for the regulations, and what that might mean for the regulated community. So to start, we're going to start with things that have been impacted by congressional disapproval, simply because this has been more impactful so far. So the first item you're seeing here is that waste emissions charge for petroleum natural gas systems. That has gone through congressional disapproval. That process has been completed with a presidential signature. So this regulation was finalized on November 18th, 2024, and effective January 17th, 2025. This imposed and collected an annual charge on methane emissions that exceeded 25,000 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent of greenhouse gases per year. On March 14th, the president signed a joint congressional resolution that was called Public Law 119-2. And it actually disapproved this waste emissions charge final rule. Based on that action, the rule is no longer enforceable and not in effect. And we do want to note that the text of the rule still remains in the CFR until further agency action to remove it. And you're going to see on here, we did include a link for a blog article that Dakota relatively recently wrote about this new regulation because it set a new precedent for emissions charges. But as you can see, things have changed so quickly. This rule has now already been overturned. There's a couple other examples here that I've included of other regulations that are currently moving through the congressional disapproval process. There was a rubber tire manufacturing NESHAP effective November 29th, 2024, which amended the existing NESHAP and addressed unregulated hazardous air pollutants. There was a reclassification of major sources rule, which was actually finalized back in September 24. And that allowed a major source of hazardous air pollutants to reclassify as an area source after acting to limit emissions. What was interesting about this one was there were corrections to the original rule effective January 7th, 2025. When we look at the congressional disapproval that's moving through, it's actually targeting not just the corrections, but the entire rule. The other regulation we noted here is the regulation of PCE under TSCA, which was finalized December 18th, 2024. This rule prohibited most industrial and commercial uses, including the manufacturing, processing, and distribution of those uses of PCE. The final rule also requires implementing a workplace chemical safety protection program for the use of PCE and establishes record-keeping and notification procedures. This rule was effective January 17th, 2025. So as I mentioned, as the congressional disapproval process moves through, we don't really know how long that'll take, if it will be finalized. The rules are in effect now, but very likely to be impacted the same way that the waste emissions charge rule was. So the next group of regulations I want to talk about briefly here are some regulations that have been impacted by the regulatory freeze. So you're seeing several regulations here where the effective dates of the regulation have been delayed. And I want to talk a little bit about this TCE regulation because it has had a lot of activity in this first quarter. On December 17th, 2024, EPA finalized the regulation for the manufacturing, processing, distribution, and commerce use and disposal of TCE or products containing it under TSCA. The final rule prevents consumer access to TCE and restricts commercial and industrial use of the chemical, with some exceptions as long as worker protections are in place. The planned effective date was January 16th, 2025. So much like that TCE rule that I talked about earlier, if you're a facility that uses TCE, this could impact you. Now, what has happened with this over the course of the first quarter is a little bit interesting here. So the EPA received multiple petitions for review of the final rule in various circuit courts. On January 13th, there was a temporary stay of the final rule's effective date that was put in place by the Fifth Circuit Court. All of the cases from the various courts were then consolidated into one lawsuit in the Third Circuit Court. On January 25th or 16th, 2025, the Third Circuit Court issued an order leaving the temporary administrative stay of the effective date. Then on January 28th, the EPA delayed the effective date of the final rule to March 21st. On March 21st, the EPA then further delayed the effective date to June 20th, but only for TCE provisions for conditions for the time limit exceptions for TCE critical or essential use. So only for the exemptions. That meant that as of March 21st, all other provisions of the TCE final rule have taken effect. And then subsequently on March 28th, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals lifted the stay for all of the provisions except for the conditions associated with the exemptions. Now, meanwhile, there also has been a congressional disapproval filed back on January 22nd, and if that moves through and is finalized, this entire rule would be disapproved. So one last group of regulations I want to talk about very briefly here are some things that are still progressing, still in effect. They haven't been impacted by the administration change. There have been a few different things happening with the COVID-19 pandemic era regulations. So there were two different things. There was a healthcare emergency temporary standard. In June of 2021, OSHA implemented this to protect healthcare and healthcare support service workers from occupational exposure to COVID-19. It was codified in 29 CFR 1910 as Subpart U. That on January 15th, 2025, was terminated with the exception of requirements to establish, maintain, and provide copies of COVID-19 logs or to report COVID-19 fatalities and hospitalizations. It still remains in the CFR that has not been pulled by the agency yet. But also to note, on February 5th, OSHA issued an additional memo which immediately stayed the enforcement of the record keeping and reporting requirements. So essentially that means that OSHA will not enforce the COVID-19 record keeping and reporting requirements until further notice. And it means they will not cite employers for violations related to these requirements. The other program, I'll just touch on this quick, is the National Emphasis Program. That was issued on July 7th, 2021 as a directive. And it essentially ensured that employees in high hazard industries and those associated with healthcare were protected from COVID-19. As of January 16th, OSHA also canceled that directive. Another area that hasn't really been impacted, there have been some NPDES permits that have either been newly developed for upcoming permits or revised. NPDES permits are only good for a certain period of time, and then a new permit is developed by the EPA. So the NPDES stormwater construction permit was issued with modifications for the 2022 general permit that remains in effect. On December 13th, the EPA proposed modifications. Generally, they added lands of exclusive federal jurisdiction and then expanded eligibility for construction activities in those areas, clarified requirements for projects discharging to receiving waters in those areas, and they also clarified the eligibility requirements related to endangered species. Now, if you remember, you probably saw that in blue a couple slides back, and that is because the comment period has been extended on this one, part of that regulatory freeze. The other two are new permits. So there is a new 2026 NPDES pesticide general permit that is coming out. That was announced on December 17th, 2024. It would go into effect October 31st, 2026, and it's effective for 5 years until 2031. The differences from the current 2021 permit are really just revisions to ensure that permitted discharges do not jeopardize endangered species and their habitat, and also changes to requirements for notices of intent. The last one here, the 2026 NPDES Stormwater Permit Multi-Sector General Permit, has also been proposed back on December 13th. This would replace the 2021 general permit, which expires on February 28th, 2026, in locations where EPA is the permitting authority. Significant changes here are going to be stormwater control measure enhancements for major storm events, improved specificity and clarity of water quality-based effluent limitations, monitoring changes, and some additional implementation measures. So the other two you see on this slide, cybersecurity regulation updates and annual civil penalty increases. I just want to touch on these very quickly since we're running short on time here. But we have seen two different cybersecurity regulations come through. One final rule for marine transport, where we're helping facilities respond to potential cybersecurity issues that may cause transportation security incidents. And then also a proposed rule that impacts certain pipeline facilities transporting essentially hazardous liquids and gases. That proposed rule would require physical security, cybersecurity, including program development, evaluations, plans, reporting, and training. And then annual civil penalty increases. We expect these pretty much every year. This year, we've seen some things come through for DOT, specifically for both transportation and pipeline safety, and the Bureau of Environmental Management for oil and gas operations in the Outer Continental Shelf. All in all, those are expected and pretty normal things. And I just want to touch on a couple more specific things. So we've talked about these more broadly applicable regulations, but there's been so many updates in Q1. We've also seen requirements for PPE in the construction industry, clarification on water quality certification requirements for hydropower facilities. We've seen a lot of additions to the list of endangered and threatened species, updates to some of the Coast Guard's mariner credentialing programs in terms of the actual program and then training course completion. We've also seen hazardous materials endorsement exemptions for transporting aviation fuels associated specifically with agriculture operations. And there's been a bunch of significant new use rules for various chemical substances. I just want to say that obviously those hit very specific things, but if they impact you, you care about those. So where do we go from here? We've talked very briefly about some of the things that have happened in first quarter. Where do we go from here? It looks like the EPA is very strongly focusing on deregulation going forward. The driving force behind that is a January 31st, 2025 executive order titled Eliminating 10 Regulations for Each New Regulation Issued. That order requires that whenever an agency promulgates a new rule, regulation, or guidance, it must identify at least 10 existing rules, regulations, or guidance documents to be repealed. We don't know exactly what that means. Are they talking about entire rules, such as the Clean Water Act? Are they talking about a paragraph or a subparagraph of a rule? That remains to be seen. We will see how that starts to play out as we go. But also it says that for fiscal year 2025, the total incremental cost of all new regulations, including repealed regulations, must be less than zero. So that is driving agencies to start thinking about how they can deregulate. Now, on March 12th, we saw the EPA release their press release, and they specifically called out certain industries. So the industries they called out are very heavily focused on energy, greenhouse gas reporting. They called out the niche apps in terms of evaluating them across all areas. And these are areas that they are very specifically looking to target for deregulation. What does that mean in terms of immediately? Probably not a lot immediately, because they can't just immediately remove all regulations that they don't like. An administration cannot do that. There's still processes. Proper processes will need to be followed. We've seen a lot of law firms come out and say that they don't expect this to be an immediate thing, and that there's lots of challenges expected, and it's going to slow and potentially stop in some cases that progress. All in all, though, we do expect that we're going to see more regulation repeals coming forward. They could be directly through agencies, or they could be through congressional disapproval. We expect CFR text changes will be made following any congressional disapprovals, but we don't know what the timeline of that could be. We also expect changes in requirements, potentially fewer requirements for many industries. We expect to see more of the enforcement discretion that we've seen already. And then after the initial transition period, we expect that agencies will again begin to issue new regulations. We also think there may be some creative ways to bypass regulations, because we've already seen that in March when the EPA created an email address and asked for regulated entities to request exemptions, which would essentially be a presidential pardon from current regulations. And one last point I want to make. What is the role of state regulations as we move forward? Well, right now, states create many of their own regulations. They may make regulations as long as they are at least as stringent as the federal regulation. State regulations may be more stringent than their corresponding federal regulations. We expect to see that some states will begin to issue their own regulations to replace repealed federal regulations or to cover gaps when certain industries are deregulated at a federal level. States may also go the other way. They may make their own regulations less stringent to match less stringent federal regulations. Either way, those regulations are also going to need to be monitored and kept up to date with, just like the federal regulations. So that concludes my information. I'm going to throw this back over to Bob, and we are going to run through a quick poll.
All right. Thank you very much, Jennifer. That was a lot of good information. As you noted, we'd like to do kind of a short poll here to kind of get the pulse of attendees. The question we see here are, what are your greatest concerns regarding potential deregulation in your industry? So we'll give you just 20 seconds or so to answer that question. I'm going to go ahead and pull the screen grab back, and then we'll go ahead and share those results. Okay. And it looks like responses are coming in. I also see that we have some questions coming in, so we will get to those in a few minutes here, so keep them coming. And I will go ahead and I will close this poll down in just another 5 seconds here. Again, this is a multiple choice, so you can pick all that that apply to you, or all responses that you feel you'd like to respond to. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this, and we will share it out. Okay, and everyone should see those results now. From what I can see on this end, loss of regulatory guidance at 54% is the greatest one. Inconsistent enforcement or interpretation would be the second place with about 42%. Very few people had no major concerns, so interesting to see. Okay. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and pull that down. And then, like I said, we will move into Q&A. I'm just going to take a few minutes here, and I am going to walk through a little bit of Dakota solutions. So, all right. And so I know a lot of people on this call are Dakota clients. So, but for those of you who don't know of Dakota, we've been serving the EHS space for more than 35 years. Back in 1988, we began with a comprehensive environmental auditing tool. And while EHS auditing is still a central part of our compliance management solutions, we have shifted to a proactive compliance approach that leverage site-specific regulatory registers and compliance calendars. So I'm going to walk through a little bit of how we do that now. So, well, software is in our name. Software is only part of what we do. As Jennifer pointed out, our team of in-house regulatory experts continually update and refine an EHS regulatory database. It's integrated into the software product. So this unique combination is what allows us to deliver regulatory intelligence to our clients and the type of information they need to maintain proactive compliance programs that are standardized, efficient, and scalable. At a high level, though, what Dakota really delivers is certainty. And in this environment, I think it's more important than ever. Certainty around what regulations apply, what updates that updates and are reviewed and understood by all of your facilities, and that compliance tasks are being completed on time. And so we use this color green throughout our products to demonstrate, or to represent that certainty. And so I'm going to call out a few areas specifically. So central to our solutions is a decision tree applicability engine. And what that means is simply the system presents yes or no questions to guide users in outlining what regulatory obligations apply to their locations. So on the left-hand side here, we see a part of the regulatory domain hierarchy, and you can see how we're using the color coding, and the gauge at the bottom shows a count of the regulatory domains. Green would recommend ones that apply. Gray would be ones that don't apply, and most importantly are the yellow. Those are the unknown, and that's where the risk lies. So along with documenting what rules apply, locations can document the why they apply. So you can see the ability to add explanations, documents, images to help retain that really important EHS institutional knowledge. Jennifer also mentioned that with the current regulatory environment, we're likely going to see a shift to the importance of state requirements. And so I just wanted to note Dakota covers state requirements as well as U.S. federal and other specific areas, but we cover state requirements as exception, and they are listed in line with the related federal requirements. So here we can see how they're called out in the product, assisting with the applicability determination. And when more guidance is needed on making that determination, there are links out to the regulatory citations that take you to a plain language library to help clarify. So speaking of the plain language library, here we can see how topics are organized, highlighting the citations along with any recent changes, which are highlighted in green, and provide overviews for regulatory clarification. And if additional information is needed, the citations link out to full text versions as well. So next I want to talk about regulatory change management. So as the regulatory database is updated, there's many visual indicators in the product that highlight where changes have occurred and prompt review. So on the left-hand side here, we can see little green triangles that indicate where changes have occurred. If those changes impact applicability, the folders will turn to yellow to indicate that additional analysis is required to make that the applicability determination. Here we can see that change Jennifer mentioned related to the removal of the COVID temporary standard, and how the citations and overviews guide users kind of through that review process. Note that while the regulatory database is updated monthly in our product, users are notified as relevant changes as soon as they are published in the Federal Register, so it as often as daily. So here we can see an example of an email alert related to the TCE exemption postponement. And these email alerts are important because they just don't notify users of the relevant changes, but they also link to a detailed report that lists each profile and location affected by the change. So it really helps to understand the impact of a change on an organization. Of course, as legal registers are updated, you'll want to update your compliance plans accordingly. So for all regulatory topics that apply, it's easy to schedule out recurring compliance tasks based on the requirements. And so these tasks include links to the related citations, again, helping to provide guidance to site staff, and ensuring the completeness and accuracy of compliance calendars. So these task occurrences can then be tracked and managed to completion. Here we see a calendar view that shows completed, open, and past due tasks, again color-coded with gray, red, and green indicating their status. These task details also, again, contain those links to the citations to provide that guidance. Tasks can be presented in this calendar view, in a list view, or even in a dashboard view. Email notifications and alerts help keep everything on track, notifying responsible persons and their managers if needed. We refer to that as nagware, and it makes sure that nothing falls through the cracks. And then finally, one final note, pulling it all together is a comprehensive compliance dashboard. And this is just one example, but this is a good one because it shows that rolled up what we call regulatory preparedness. It shows those profile gauges that help corporate leaders or regional EHS leaders understand how aware their sites are of their regulatory obligations. And that could have to do with the completeness of the applicability going through and doing it to the end, or if something that has recently occurred has been reviewed or not. So that you combine that with the KPIs and dashboards of task status, and it really does provide a 360-degree view of the organization's overall compliance status and program. So with that said, I know we have a lot of questions that have come in. I'll invite Jennifer back to answer some of these questions. And as she does that, we like your feedback on how valuable this webinar was. So I'm just going to ask if everyone can just take a few minutes to complete exit poll telling us how we did, and then we'll answer questions along the way.
Thanks, Bob. So I just want to, I do see there are some very specific questions in here, but we have one here that says, so with the heat stress standard on the docket for OSHA, would that 10-to-1 deregulation guideline delay it? It very well may. I think what we don't know is with that deregulation guideline out there from the executive branch, what we don't know really is, does that mean that agencies won't make new rules? Does that mean that agencies will find things to knock out of their regulatory repertoire so that way they can make new rules? I think we have to kind of wait to see specifically what they do. But I will just say one thing that I have seen very recently looking at the Federal Register is we have seen a couple of agencies start to ask for public suggestions on rules that maybe aren't working well, or maybe things that the public or the regulated community would like them to look at. So it seems like we're starting to see, and I can reference DOT did this very recently. It looks like we're starting to see some agencies looking for things that maybe they can cut or look at cutting. So I think we're just going to have to wait and see what is going on with that. As far as there were a couple questions about some other OSHA regs, the walk around rule and the heat and illness prevention rules. I don't have any additional information on those right here with me, so I can't really answer those specific questions. And then Bob, we have a couple of questions about copies of the slides and sharing the recording.
Yes, we will follow up with everybody with links to a recording and to the slide deck. Yes, for sure. Okay. Nope, here's another one. Jennifer, can you see that one?
Yep.
Okay.
You know if California plans to make any changes, deregulations, or if they plan to stay the course for the time being. Well, from what we're seeing in California, and I actually do state research for California, I can say that they are still issuing lots of regulations. Things still seem to be business as usual with California, and I have not seen anything that has come through which would make me think otherwise at this point.
Okay. We'll pause to see if there's any additional questions. And I know that we're delivering 15 minutes of content there, so I know that some people were just interested in getting the overview, so that's okay. But if you do have additional questions, we will stick around as long as you have them. All right. Question on TCE. Yeah, I don't see that question. Do you see it, Jennifer? Uh-oh, are you frozen, Jennifer?
No, okay, there we go.
Okay.
No, I'm trying to pull that up too, and I don't see it.
Videos on how to set up a compliance calendar. There's help guidance to assist with that, and we'll definitely have someone get in touch with you with those materials for sure.
As far as the climate rules, we do expect them to target climate rules. They have not said anything in terms of specifically data centers or what they're going to target, but we know that the climate rules are a target of the current administration, specifically because that doesn't play well with their take on oil and gas. They want to promote oil and gas, they want to promote drilling, and the climate rules are not going to work well with that. So they have specifically in that aspect talked about climate rules, but data centers have not been mentioned one way or another. Okay, the TCE rule. That's the one that I think that's the same one that I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the delayed enforcement of the exemptions. The remaining provisions were all effective March 21st. And that was the one that had multiple delays and the court stays and everything else. So as of March 21st, everything except for the requirements for the exemptions went into effect. The exemptions go into effect in June. I believe that's like June 20th. And that is also subject to a congressional disapproval. So just mentioning that again. So the entire thing could potentially be wiped out.
All right, and then maybe this last one about the risk management program.
So right now, the only thing we've heard is EPA. EPA has come out and targeted risk management programs as an area that they want to look at. In terms of whether or not that will affect OSHA, we don't really know that yet. That remains to be seen what happens with OSHA and what they really decide to do with their regulations as well. But for now, we know for the EPA perspective, those regulations are at least mentioned as something that the administration would like to target.
Okay. Well, we will go ahead and wrap it up then. If there's some questions in here specific to product training and things like that, we'll definitely get back to those who have those questions. And as mentioned, we will share the recording of this and the slide deck. So thank you to Jennifer for putting this presentation together. Thank you everyone who took time out of their day to join us on the call. And we hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot, everyone.